Welcome to the Information Systems Project, Topic 4. Topic 4 is going to look at use case development. We've looked at use cases, or we've mentioned use cases earlier on in the course. For this topic we're going to actually look at how we develop a use case diagram and how we build use cases. As previously we've discussed systems development methodologies, and within those I've mentioned use cases. And we've mentioned a number of different methodologies, but primarily looked at the waterfall model. We've also discussed systems development and its relationship with your project. Remember, yours is an academic project, not just a development project, so there will be other things that you need to consider in addition to how you're going to develop the application as efficiently and as correctly as possible. Finally, we looked at ways of choosing a methodology and some of the implications that will affect your choice of methodology. So in this topic we're going to look at developing requirements using use cases, and then once we've done that we'll have a look at how we can prioritise the development based on the use cases and the requirements that we've discovered. Once you've completed this topic, you should be able to understand the use case approach to requirement specification, and you should be able to prioritise the development of the requirements for your project. Use cases are used in the early stages of systems development, often to identify the requirements. So they are used to help identify and document the full functionality of the system that's under consideration. This may be a larger system than the one that will be developed, and in fact I usually encourage the development of a large set of use cases and then to reduce the number based on the time available for development. Use case diagrams are used to document the set of use cases that have been established for the system, and they're links to the users of the system, which are represented by actors. So use cases are the specification of the functionality, and use case diagrams link that specification and that functionality to the users. Quite often use cases and use case diagrams are confused when early in development, but they're not the same thing. A use case is a description of a set of sequences of actions, including variants, that the system performs to yield an observable result of value to an actor. This is directly taken from the book by Booch, Rombaugh and Jacobson. So a use case is a description, first of all. It's a description of a set of sequences of actions. So there are a number of sequences of actions in a single use case, quite possibly. The set of sequences includes any variants of actions, and these are usually exceptional circumstances. For example, if we consider somebody withdrawing money from an ATM, then at some point during the transaction, before they've withdrawn the cash, they might decide that they want to cancel the transaction. So the cancellation of the transaction would be a variant on the sequence of actions. So a use case is a description of a set of sequences of actions, including the variants, that the system performs to yield an observable result of value to an actor. So the result of a use case occurring is observable. Something has happened, something has changed, and that result is of value to a user, or an actor as they're called in UML. So we've mentioned actors. A use case diagram allows us to visualize the relationship between use cases and the actors that use them. So we'll have a number of actors in a system, and we'll have a number of use cases, and the actors can use some of those use cases and other actors will use other use cases. An actor represents a coherent set of roles that the users of use cases play when interacting with use cases. So when we deal with the word actor, actors usually play roles, and it's the same in use case diagrams. The actors play a set of roles. Those roles are the roles of users, and a user will have different roles depending on how they're using the system. So if we consider the campus system for the IL3n0mBOvAVfAzVD course, then when you use the chat room, you're playing the role of a student. When I'm using the chat room, I will use the role of a member of staff. So when you're using your role as a student, you can log into the chat room and you can make conversation with other people there. When I am using my role as a member of staff, additionally to being able to log into the chat room and converse with the people that are there, I can also create chat rooms. I can also create lists of transcriptions of the chat that has taken place in the chat room. So I've got more use cases because my role as a member of staff allows me to do so. You have fewer use cases because your role as a student doesn't allow you to do certain additional things. So this is quite common when we've got administrators who have not only standard set of functionality but will also have some additional administrative functionality with the system. So as a reminder, an actor represents a coherent set of roles that the user of the use cases play when interacting with use cases. So again, thinking of the campus system, different roles, there'll be an administrator role, there's a tutor role, and there are student roles. Okay, so this diagram is intended to show the symbols of a use case diagram, but unfortunately the symbols aren't actually quite correct. On the left hand side we've got something to represent an actor. An actor should be represented by a stick person, not just a smiley face. The use case is in the middle, that should be represented by an oval, and we can see that there is a line drawn between the actor and the use case, and that line represents an association. An association tells us that that actor can use that use case. This diagram, had it been drawn in UML, would have had the correct symbols, and we'll have got an example later on in the lecture that shows the correct symbols. As a note, I would advise you have a look at a piece of software called Argo UML and use that to try and draw some use case diagrams. On the right hand side of the diagram you can see a label that says a note about the use case. That's a standard UML symbol for a note or a comment, as it's actually identified as. Okay, so the association shows that the actor has access to a use case, and the note should be linked to the use case by a dotted line, and the use case represents a usable process by that actor. This diagram again should show a more complex example. It should have a number of stick figures down the side for each of the users. It's got book borrowers, journal borrowers, browsers and librarians. Those are the types of users, and they should, as I say, they should all be represented by stick people. And in the middle of the diagram we've got a bunch of use cases. We've got some use cases that are usable by book borrowers. There's reserve book, extend loan, borrow a copy of a book, and return a copy of a book. Now in this system we've distinguished between a user who can borrow books and a user who can borrow journals, and they're actually different things. So a book borrower, whilst they can reserve books, extend their loans, borrow copies of books and return the copies of books, cannot borrow journals. That's in this system as it's been specified. If I wanted a book borrower to borrow a journal, then I'd have to draw a line from the book borrower to the journal, borrow journal use case, and also to the return journal use case. So book borrowers can reserve books, extend loans, borrow copy of books, return copies of books. Journal borrowers can only borrow journals and return journals. I have a browser actor here who can just browse the catalogue, and we also have a librarian who can update the catalogue. Now one question that arises is what happens if the librarian wants to borrow a book? Well, they can, but they're not borrowing a book as a librarian. They'll be borrowing the book at the time playing the role of a book borrower. So if Fred was the librarian, now when Fred is working as a librarian he can update the catalogue, but if Fred wants to borrow a book he will have to play the role of a book borrower. So quite possibly, if we can imagine this as a real system, then Fred would log into the system as a librarian in order to do things like updating the catalogue, but when he wants to borrow a book, he wouldn't need to log into the system with a different ID to act as a borrower, and that would prevent him from maybe abusing his power and borrowing books for longer than he should, or borrowing more books than he should be allowed to. Okay, so it's a simplistic system, but it does illustrate a few points about use cases. So if we want an actor to be able to use a particular use case, then they will need to be drawn, an association drawn between the actor and the use case. You can see on the right hand side of the diagram that we've got some things that have been labelled as development priorities. So we've got some priority 1 use cases, and some priority 2 use cases, and some priority 3 use cases. Now, I've arbitrarily chosen these priorities, but what it does illustrate is that we can actually choose certain use cases in the system and label them as the most important parts of the system. So here you can see I've labelled priority 1 as must-haves. That means that in this system those particular use cases must exist. So those will be the first things that I would develop. So in our first iteration of the development process, I would implement borrowing a copy of a book, returning the copy of a book, and also the ability for somebody to browse. If I never complete any more of the system, at least I've got those parts of the system, and those would be the ones that were considered the most important during the requirement solicitation. Okay, and that decision would have been made by the client, the person who is commissioning the system, who wants to actually pay for the system to be implemented. So we've got priority 1, those are the must-haves. We've got priority 2 here, and that's the journal, borrowing and return, and those have also been labelled here as should-haves. And then the third priority at the top, labelled as could-haves. So the must-haves will be developed, the should-haves should be developed ideally if we've got time in a second iteration, and the could-haves quite often won't be developed, but if we have time and we have time for a third iteration of the development, then we can implement those. There is a fourth level of priority which is considered to be the won't-haves, and those are the things that, whilst they might appear on a wish list, they will actually not be implemented in this particular development. I always like to have the won't-haves on my use case diagram, because it does mean that we've got a full look at the system and we know that the client has considered every possibility, and they won't come back to us later on and say, well, hang on a minute, we actually wanted this system to do this as well. So we should create a set of use cases, relate them to our actors, and then prioritise those use cases in conjunction with the client. So as I said, use cases developed during the requirements analysis. So at the first stage of the waterfall model, we need to actually elicit the requirements, decide what the system is going to do. Okay, we can't do this independently, we have to do this in conjunction with the client if we're working on a real system. Most of you, for your projects, are working on a system that you've decided on, and you are not working for a real client. So you will have to play the role of the client as well as of the developer, and you will make some decisions about which use cases that you are going to develop. Again, I would create a wish list of all possible use cases, or as many as you can, and then decide, possibly with some advice from your supervisor, which one's the most appropriate to develop. Remember that your project isn't about developing a system, it's about what you're going to learn or what you're going to understand from developing the system. So you can choose the use cases as high priority, being the ones that are going to most adequately demonstrate what it is that you want to demonstrate through your project. So in the requirements phase, you'll create a set of all possible use cases for the system that you want, and then you'll decide which particular parts of the system are the most important to you for your project and prioritise those as priority number 1. The aim being that you will actually implement those, and then if you've got time you can go and have a look at priority 2 and then maybe priority 3. The other thing I'll say at this stage is that you would go through the whole waterfall model using your priority 1 use cases. So you'll create a full set of use cases, prioritize them, and then you'll go through the design, implementation, testing and maintenance phases for the priority 1 use cases and create a completed system. Then, as I say, if you have time, then you can go through the requirements, design, implementation, verification, maintenance for the second level priority. That does add some complication because you've got to do some integration testing to make sure that the newly developed use cases do work, as well as not changing any of the functionality of the initial first priority use cases. So when we're developing use cases, there's a number of things we have to do. First of all, we need to decide who the actors are, who are the users of our system, and how do we classify those users, how do we group them into sets of roles. So for each actor, once we've identified the set, we can decide on what they're going to use the system for. Okay, this isn't necessarily something that we can do in specific order. We might decide on some of the actors, start thinking about functionality, and then realise that we've forgotten some of the actors, so we can go back. And between point 1 and 2 here, we can do a little bit of iteration just to make sure we've got a full set of actors and a full set of use cases. Once we've got that full set of actors and full set of use cases, and there doesn't need to be a lot of detail at this point, we can then draw the actors and use cases in a use case diagram. Okay, so just to reiterate that, first of all, it's helpful to decide on the actors. Then, secondly, once we've got a set of actors, we go through each one and think about how they will use the system. Once we've identified the use cases that they will use the system with, then we draw the actors and use cases in a use case diagram. And I'd recommend using Argo UML because it's free and easy to use, and you should be able to find it on the web, and you can run it from the web. You don't have to install it on any computer. The fourth stage here then is to write use case descriptions for every use case. Okay, so you've identified the use cases on your diagram, but now you actually need to add descriptions. And those descriptions should identify the actors involved, they should identify any pre and post conditions that have to be in place, and it should identify the primary path through the use case, so what happens at each step through that use case. Okay, it's not always easy to do this, as I've noted at the bottom here, and usually you'll need to go around these 4 steps in any order actually, and a number of times in order to get it right. In a real application development, you would do this in consultation with the client, so you would develop your use case diagram. Before you start writing your use case descriptions in any detail, I would go and see the client and talk them through who you consider the actors to be and what the use cases are, and this should then give you a clearer picture as to whether you understand the system or not. Then when you go through and write the use case descriptions, you can go through each one individually with the client to make sure that they understand the details of each use case as well as the name of it. So this is what I call use case driven development. We create some use cases at the start, and they are used throughout the whole development life cycle. So use case driven development is a systems development process that's based on use cases. Use cases are used to elicit and document the functional requirements of the system at the initial stages. We also use use cases to actually distribute work amongst the team members. We've identified the functionality, and we've divided it up amongst roles, and we've divided it up amongst use cases, and we can allocate certain use cases to certain members of the team. So if you were in a team of 5 developers and you had 10 main use cases in your system, then those can be divided quite easily between the members of the team. Use cases also used to direct and prioritise the development. So we've got a full set of use cases on our diagram, and we can generate the priorities as I've shown you in the previous diagram. Use cases also drive the test plans. When we actually test our system, we're testing it to verify that it does actually meet the requirements. and of course our use cases do describe what the requirements are. So quite early on in the development process we've actually described what we're testing the system against, and we always use the use cases to test the functional requirements of the system. Okay, so I'm not quite sure what happened to the previous diagrams, but this is actually the diagram that I want you to see. This shows an example of a use case diagram that has been generated using Argo UML, the tool that I've mentioned on a number of occasions. So you can see down the left hand side we've got our stick people have finally appeared. This is the way that we represent actors in UML. So we've got book borrowers, journal borrowers, browsers and librarian. Our use cases are represented by ovals in the middle, and of course they represent what the users can do with the system. And we've got our priorities, which are notes in UML. Okay, you can tell they're notes because they're a little turned over corner, and their notes are linked to other elements of UML using a dotted line, as you can see in this diagram. I tend to draw my actors down the left and my notes down the right, and that's just the way I like to see the diagrams drawn. It makes them easier to read, but you will actually see plenty of diagrams with actors all over the place, and I tend to draw a box around my set of use cases to identify where the boundary of the system is. This isn't part of UML and isn't necessary, but what I find is that if we have a boundary around our system, then quite early on in the development we can see these lines here where the association crosses the boundary of the system, and we can actually view these points here where the association crosses the boundary as points at which we will need to design the user interface. So for example, we've got a book borrower here who will be able to reserve a book, so the fact that this association crosses the boundary of the system implies that there will be some interaction between the book borrower and this use case, and we can probably fairly early in the development life cycle create a user interface that represents that boundary. Whilst that could mislead the client and suggest that the development is further on than it really is, it is actually a useful tool for being clear about how the client wants that functionality implemented. Clients, if they have no idea about computer systems and development, will think about their system in terms of how they use it, not how it actually works, and so having a user interface for them to tell you, allowing them to tell you whether you've got it right or wrong, is actually a really useful tool and a good way of communicating with the client. So I always put this box around the system, and I always use it to help me define the user interfaces at these points here. Okay, so I've already mentioned this earlier on. Each use case, when we create a use case diagram, every single use case on that diagram will need a specification. This is really now part of the detailed analysis of our system. So we've elicited the requirements by showing the client an initial use case diagram, and they've said yes, this is fine, or no, this needs more detail, and so on. So once we've got the full set of use cases, we then have to give each a specification. The use case specification describes the purpose that the use case fulfills. It provides a detailed sequence of activities, and those will be drawn actually using a UML activity diagram. It will describe the actors that can use that use case and any pre and post conditions. The preconditions are conditions that must be true in order for that use case to occur, and post conditions are conditions that become true after the occurrence of that use case. So if I wanted to describe a use case that allowed somebody to withdraw money from a bank machine or an ATM, then one of the preconditions must be that the user has successfully entered their PIN number. Otherwise we'll be providing cash to all sorts of people who haven't actually put their PIN number in. So a precondition for providing cash in an ATM would be a correct entry of a PIN number. And one of the post conditions of providing cash at an ATM is that the balance in the bank account will be reduced by the amount that has been withdrawn. It would be nice if that didn't happen as well. So the use case specification does contain a lot of useful information. As I've said, it's the purpose that the use case fulfills. What's it going to do? Its detailed sequence of activities, often drawn as a diagram, but that can be done as text as well if it's more appropriate. The set of actors that can use it, and a description of the pre and post conditions that will hold before and after execution of that use case. Okay, so at this point the set of use cases is now complete and development priorities are agreed. We know which use cases are possible, we know which ones we're going to develop in the initial iteration of the development process. So now what we need to do is actually understand those use cases in more detail. Okay, and we will generate probably extra use cases as part of that research. And as I've already alluded to in previous slides, that each priority band should be viewed as an increment in our incremental development approach. Again, if you specify a set of use cases for your project and you prioritise some as high priority, you will be expected to complete all of those high priority use cases. So I would suggest that you limit the priority 1 use cases to the absolute essential functionality, and then include any other functionality you think you should develop as a level 2 priority, and then you can go back and redevelop your system using the level 1 first and then the level 2 priority use cases. Okay, so the tutorial material for this topic will actually involve you creating an initial use case diagram and starting to look at the detail of your use cases. At the moment you're still working on your project proposals, so really you're deciding on the functionality of your system. So the detail of use cases, the use case specification, isn't crucial at this stage. What you do need to do though is actually list the use cases, list the actors, and then decide what it is that you're going to develop. Okay, and that will form part of your project proposal. Okay, so we've got the usual references of the Dawson and the Weaver book for looking at the projects. They don't really deal with use cases, although they will mention them as part of the systems development approaches. There's again a Wikipedia entry on the waterfall model on there, but there will be an entry on use cases, and that may be of some use as well. The book by Somerville will mention use cases, but probably the most useful reference here is use of Scott Ambler's book, and he's also got a website, and the book is called The Elements of UML2 Style. The website actually contains quite a lot of information about use cases as well, so it's definitely worth having a look. So do a quick search for agilemodelling.com and you should find Scott Ambler's pages about use cases. Okay, so that was the topic 4 for the Information Systems project. Hopefully it's given you an idea of how to generate a set of requirements for your system, and those will go forward into your project proposals. So next week we'll have a look at the project planning process and how that relates to the use cases that you've developed, and then we'll be moving slowly into the final preparation of your proposals and how you present those proposals, and also how you'll present your final project report. As usual, if you've got any questions, I'll be available on the chat, and I'll create chat pages on Tuesday mornings and Thursday mornings, and there'll also be some discussion available to you as well.